we are honoured to have Professor Tom Shakespeare, who is Professor of Disability Research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Tom has 30 years of experience researching with disabled people, and with his and he also writes and presents extensively about issues facing people with disabilities. Tom writes on everything from dementia rights, social model of disability, relationships and disability, and bioethics. So, without further delay, I'd like to welcome Tom to our first Co-Produce Care podcast. So, welcome, Tom. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much
much. Glad
for
to be here.
coming on. Great. So what I thought might be a good idea to start off, if you could talk a little bit about your interests and your research and your own experience with disability for people who don't know you.
Okay, so I'm disabled myself. I was born with restricted growth, and about 11 years ago, I became paralyzed, which is a complication of restricted growth. So I now use a wheelchair, and it was a turning point in my life, because prior to that, I didn't receive any care or welfare support at all. And then, obviously, becoming a wheelchair user, my needs were greater. I was in rehab hospital and things like that. But my research for something like 30 years has been with disabled people, as you mentioned, various aspects of life, including sexuality and children with disability and all sorts of things. When I don't know if it was when I became paralyzed, but certainly about 10 or 15 years ago, I became interested in personal assistance and independent living. And I used personal assistance for a while when I was first paralyzed. And we did a project called PA Relationships, because there's a lot of research about employing and whether it's empowering and all those sorts of aspects. But I wanted to know, you've got two people, they're in some sort of a professional relationship. They also presumably are in some sort of social relationship. And what's that like? And what helps it go well? What helps it go less well? And I can talk more about that, but that was a piece of work that we did, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And I've also done other projects about rehabilitation and so forth. And currently I'm doing a lot of work in Africa and Asia, working with disabled people in all sorts of settings, again, trying to remove barriers and promote their inclusion.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that the work you're doing over there. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I think it'd be interesting to find out the comparisons with their approach compared to our approach over here. Actually, why don't we talk
Sure,
about it
I'll talk
now?
about anything. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, obviously, I mean, I work now at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I had spent 5 years at the World Health Organization, where we edited the World Report on Disability and International Perspectives on Spinal Cord Injury and other work. And it really sensitized me to the global experience of disability. 4/5 of disabled people are in the developing world. I mean, there's 1 billion disabled people in the world. That's an awful lot of folk. And I think in UK, we get a little bit focused on our own needs and problems, and we don't see what it's like in the rest of the world. So I wanted to try and help understand more about global disability. And so, yeah, I've been in, I don't know, Mozambique, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Sierra Leone, South Africa,
Wow.
Tanzania, India, researching with disabled people. I've just booked a trip to South India in January, so I'm very excited about going to Vellore and Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And I mean, obviously, those societies are very unequal. If you have money,
Yeah.
it's very easy to employ people to support you. There's lots of people who want work, and there's lots of people who work as servants. So there is a tradition. And I know folk who've talked about their elderly relatives in South Africa, say, who say, look, there are lots of people who want work, and this is a very easy way to support people in their own homes. However, that's the elite. Those are people who have some money to afford to pay for servants. Most people cannot, and therefore they're reliant on their family. And it can be very, very difficult indeed. And I think some children with disabilities are neglected to death, let us say. And
Wow.
obviously, people don't live as long generally. Access to healthcare is much poorer. I mean, the plus side is that the household and the family tend to look after disabled members, but it may not be a very easy life. Many countries are now starting what we would call social protection, which is payments to support individuals or families with disabilities. But those payments are usually very, very low, maybe $10, $20 a month. So they're still, a real financial issue. So yeah, I can talk about that all day, but
Yeah,
it's
that's really
very interesting
interesting.
to experience.
And also because you've been to so many different countries in the global south, do you feel that anywhere is actually doing things that we could learn from?
I
Because
think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't. I mean, obviously, income is so low and government services are so limited. But I think that the approach of community-based rehabilitation, now often called disability inclusive development, is very promising. You have workers in the community identifying disabled people, trying to promote really self-help and community initiatives. I mean, I love going to Africa or Asia. I meet a huge number of disabled people who are really very empowered and are fighting for their rights. And you know, it's when you have very little, you value what you have and you work together to make the situation better. I mean, I'm not saying that you know lots of people would look at what we have in Britain and just think, oh my goodness, that's just amazing. And
mm,
you have people who you can pay personal assistance. You get a grant to pay for your personal independence or whatever it might be. Even though we consider these welfare systems to be inadequate and ineffective, compared to anything that a household would get in these countries, it's much better. So I think it teaches us or helps us appreciate a bit more what we have. And there are those initiatives. There's more, if you like, pride. There is more self-reliance because
mm,
people have to get on with it. And there's this initiative, the CBR approach. And the good thing about it is that it brings together health, education, livelihoods, empowerment in one approach. And there are these community development workers essentially who go out and try and enable communities to support disabled people. And I've met some really amazing disabled folk in Africa and Asia who are standing up for their rights every day.
it's really interesting you could just say that, because the concept of community, I think, in some countries is quite strong. And in terms of thinking about, we'll come on to this later, but compliance with certain UN conventions, I'm thinking about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I feel like I've read somewhere that some of the global south countries might be more compliant in some areas than the UK, potentially because they don't have the institutions that we have. So I think it would be really interesting to see some of the work that comes out from your research on that. Do you know when it's going to be published, or is it going to be a
Well, I
spoiler
know
alert?
there's a constant stream of papers. So,
Okay,
my group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is called the International Centre for Evidence on Disability. And we're
okay,
publishing work all the time. So if people look for the London School of LSHTM, and then our group is called ICED. I'm sorry, there are all these acronyms,
that's fine.
but
We'll put a link to it somewhere.
you'll find dozens of papers. And we're really committed. I've just been advertising a new PhD studentship for a disabled person from Uganda.
Oh, yeah.
And rather than, I mean, they will come here, but mainly we're going to support them to do research in Uganda. We've got other studentships in Kenya and Zambia. And
Mm,
what I'm really conscious of, I've traveled, as you say, a lot, but what I think we're lacking is disabled researchers from those
yeah.
countries. And so we're trying to support the development of that cadre of people.
That's fantastic. We'll definitely try to push for better awareness of that opportunity as well.
Thank you.
Um, one of the things I thought would be nice to talk about is the social model of disability. So I work in health and social care. And a lot of the discussions, the debates around the social model of disability and what it means to people in academia and in practice, I think sometimes doesn't get talked about as much. And I know you've written extensively about the model and also criticised the model in certain different ways. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the social model and what it is and how it differs from, say, the medical model, which we have a lot in this country in certain ways. And then we can sort of go on to maybe the criticisms of it.
Sure. Back in the 1970s, there was a huge explosion of disability radicals, grassroots disability radicals, trying to understand their own situation and improve things. And there was the Liberation Network of people with disabilities. There was Sisters Against Disablement. There was a lesbian disabled group called Gemma. And there was a group called UPIAS, UPIAS, Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And they were a Leninist group. They expelled people for not toeing the line. They were pretty hard line. And they came up with the social model of disability, as it became called. And basically, they redefined disability. Previously, progressive people had talked about maybe persons with disabilities or people with disabilities, i.e. people first who happen to have health conditions or disabilities. And UPIAS said, no, we want to say that disability is oppression. So disability is how you're excluded by society. So people are disabled by society, not by their bodies, is the basic insight. And this is simple, it's powerful, it's empowering, because disabled people no longer feel that they have, that the problem is the impairment. They highlight the problem of the barriers and the oppression, and it spread like wildfire. Somebody from UPIAS, Vic Finkelstein, went to the 1981 Singapore convention of the new Disabled Persons International, and away it went. Now, I think it's not the only progressive approach to disability, and it's quite a specific idea, and it tends to be that people think, well, the social model is everything good, and if you're pro disability rights or you're pro disability inclusion or whatever else it might be, you must be an advocate of the social model. But I'm an academic, and I'm sorry, I want to be precise, and I think the social model is people are disabled by society, not by their bodies. And my critique of it, if you like, is to say that people are disabled by society. Yes, we must remove barriers. Yes, but bodies and minds also disable you. I think disability is complicated, and I think that the medical, the psychological, which we don't talk about very much, the social, the legal, the cultural, they all affect people who have disability or disabled people, whatever you want to call them. And we need to intervene to improve things. I mean, for example, in the developing world, one of the big issues is not getting access to healthcare. In Britain, we get very cross if we don't get good treatment in the NHS. But basically, we can assume that we will get access to healthcare. My wheelchair is a bit battered, and it's about time I got a new one. And on the NHS, every 5 years, I'm entitled to a new one. So, the idea that people are not getting any of this stuff and life is very hard in that way is not familiar, because we have an NHS in a good welfare state. I mean, they don't in America, so we'd probably be not taking it for granted there. But my argument is that we need to meet all of people's needs. One of the things, for example, in the British context, is we don't talk very much until recently about sexuality and about relationships and about family being a major aspects of what people have a right to, have a need for. That community, that friendship that we were talking about earlier. So I've wittered on, but what I'm trying to say disability is complicated.
Mm.
And we don't want to medicalize it. You referred to the medical model. I would rather talk about medicalization. When we reduce people to simple, or maybe not so simple, medical issues, and we say, well, that's all we need to know. I could have told you I have a G to A transposition at 0.380 of my FGFR3 gene, which is basically true, but it doesn't tell you anything about me. That's not how you introduced me. You'd have to know me and my life history. That gives you a sense of me, whereas the genetic change just tells you that I have restricted growth, which is true. It's not untrue, but it doesn't explain everything. So I think we want to move away from medicalization, thinking of people as labels or medical conditions. We all agree about that. I mean, I don't see anybody out there who's going, no, that guy, he's got a G2A transition, or that woman, she's got schizophrenia, that explains everything. We are complicated beings, whether, and not just disability, all sorts of things. And we don't want to reduce. I mean, you've got XX syndrome, you're a woman. But that's not relevant. I mean, the fact you're a woman is relevant. The fact that you've got two X chromosomes is not relevant in this sense. It doesn't explain things. So I think we need to take a social approach to everything, to disability, to sexuality, to ethnicity. We have to understand legacies of whatever. I'm sorry, I'm shut up now.
Well, it's almost, no, it's interesting because it's almost as if you're saying we need to understand it's too binary to say, well, you're either got a medical model or you've got a social model. It's almost like there's a tapestry of issues, and to just put to be either anti-psychiatry, which is kind of, I suppose, where the social model was maybe born out of a little bit, and then or just towards a medical model, it's too easy to just put people in those categories, and it doesn't actually help anyone, because you need to understand the whole issue that people have to grapple with. So you've got, the social model might say we need to have better wheelchair access, or we need to make our physical surroundings more suitable for people with different needs, and that's important, as is understanding what a diagnosis does to a person, explains how their condition affects them in daily life. So it's interesting.
All of those things are important, and it depends. It depends what context you're working in, and who you're talking to. Probably if I'm talking to a social worker, I'm going to say, look, I want direct payments. I want to be put in touch with my, I don't know, care agency or whatever it might be. And these are what my needs and rights are under the Care Act or whatever it is. If I'm going to see my GP, I'd say, I want painkillers. I want a referral to the rehab people, and I want to see a spinal surgeon because I got a sore back, or whatever it might be. Or I might say, look, I'm depressed. I want to see can you refer me for a psychology assessment or for a physiotherapy assessment? Or I might, as you say, I want equal rights in employment. I don't want to be discriminated against. We want all of these things. We're complex beings. And it's true. I mean, your listeners who are disabled will be saying, but barriers, much of the time, are what causes problems. And I agree. Barriers causes problems. And less so because I got an accessible bus here this morning on the way to work. I live in an accessible flat because I've got a ramp at the front. I came into my building. There's a temporary ramp because they're renovating the front, but they put a temporary ramp to make sure that disabled people could get in. I got to my office, there's an accessible loo. So hopefully, once people have got access to some of this stuff, they're going, well, what that's all been dealt with. What next? And for some people that might be a health or psychological issue. For others, it might be a cultural issue, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder, I feel like I've heard on a YouTube lecture that you gave, you had a PhD student, and they looked into the experiences of families who had children with autism, and they found that there was a class issue. So middle class people were able to access services much easier, whereas working class people their children were either labelled as just mischievous or naughty children before they got a diagnosis. And actually having a diagnosis is really helpful because then you get access to certain services. So do you do you see in your recent your experiences that people from different socioeconomical backgrounds get different support, or is that just an anomaly? Sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't.
No, it does happen. It does happen, and you're absolutely right. For children with disabilities, there is a class issue, and it's. I mean, middle class people get, and I'm middle class. you know, that's where I'm from. But middle class people get more of everything, because they are very good at what's the word, negotiating the system. They know what they're entitled to, and they go out and they get it. I mean, not always. And we've heard, in the news over the last few years, a lot of parents of children with special educational needs complaining, for example, at cuts to the SEN budgets by 10%, and terrible things. So I'm not saying just because you're middle class it's all easy. It is not. You are fighting for everything. But you have resources, you have social capital, you know who to complain to. You don't take no for an answer. You're better at negotiating a system. And if you haven't got those expectations, or you face discrimination and prejudice for various reasons, it's much harder for you. And the research you referred to is actually by a guy now who's a senior lecturer at Sunderland University, Steve MacDonald, and he was looking at diagnosis of dyslexia.
Okay.
And he was saying you're much more likely to be diagnosed with dyslexia and to get the additional learning support you need if you're middle class than if you're working class. And his research was interviewing working class people with dyslexia. But I mean, you're not wrong in the sense that exactly the same thing happens with ADHD, autism. Kids who have ADHD, if they're working class, are going to be written off as naughty, disruptive, and are less likely to get the services and the diagnosis first, and then the services they need. And I think sometimes in the social world, we tend to think that diagnosis is terrible and that it's labeling and it's awful. But the fact is, if you haven't got a diagnosis, it's very difficult to get the services to which you should be entitled. And there's some research, not done by my group, but that I've read about, for example, children with intellectual disability. And the kids that had Down syndrome, and it was very evident that they had Down syndrome, that it was, okay, you've got Down syndrome, we'll try and support you. But the kids who had intellectual disabilities but didn't have Down syndrome, it was much harder to get a diagnosis. It was troubling and difficult for the parents. When they went to the healthcare professionals or educational professionals, they couldn't prove, or they didn't have clarity about what their child's needs were, and it was much more difficult. So sometimes having a label is good. It helps us get what we are entitled to. It's not good if it means that you're just defined by that label forevermore. We did research in schools in the 1990s, and the teacher would say, this is so and so, he is an autism. So they were just treating people by the label, and it's daft. They were a little kid and they had all of these different traits and interests and stuff. To say that's an autism, that's an ADHD, that's a dyslexia, as if they're just sort of labels, is inhuman, just terrible. So it's a laziness that professionals sometimes slip into.
So kind of connected, I think, is you've talked or written about dementia and seeing dementia as a disability, which you feel that it could be quite important for people with dementia. And I actually attended a talk by Wendy Mitchell, I think the name is, and she's written a book about her experience with dementia. And one of the first things she said in the talk was it was a blessing. It was a relief when she got the diagnosis, because she didn't know what was wrong with her. She couldn't understand, and nobody else could really understand. Then as soon as she got the label, everything fell into place. So is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about when you're understanding it in that way, or more towards getting access to services, or maybe something else?
I think it's both, and I love Wendy Mitchell. I know her well, and she's just a wonderful person, and has turned what could be seen as a really negative thing into a very positive thing, which she's shared with the world. So I'm grateful to her. I think absolutely. Having a diagnosis does a number of things. Excuse me. So first thing is that, as that quote you read shows, it helps you understand what's different about you. And that, we all want to understand our lives. So that's very empowering to know that you're not imagining it, that there's something real going on. And we know, for example, that women who are diagnosed with autism in adulthood, it's tremendously empowering for them to realize why they have had some difficulties in their lives. Secondly, as you say, it identifies what your needs for services might be. It says, I'm somebody with autism, I need X, Y, Z. And that can be very empowering. And it also helps other people that they encounter not go, don't know what's wrong with them, or they're a bit odd, or they're a bit demanding, or they don't seem to be very active, or whatever it might be. They go, okay, this person's got dementia, they face these challenges. Now, you asked me about, dementia as a disability. And in a way, it's obvious. Of course, it's a disability. You can't do stuff. But what I meant by saying, and I was really happy to co-author that paper with Peter Mittler, who himself has dementia, and Hannah Zalik, who comes from a mental health background. But what we were saying is that why don't we think about the human rights of people with dementia very often? They're human beings. They have a disability. They have a disabling health condition. And it's not just the health issues that are important. It's the way they're treated. It's the way we think about the condition. It's whether we listen to them. And there's lots of problematic approaches to people with dementia. There's a whole bunch of approaches which seem to be helpful, but are a bit patronizing. I mean, we talk about dementia friendly. Let's have a dementia friendly community. And the aspiration is very, very good. But, would we say, I want to be Asian friendly. I want to be, Afro-Caribbean friendly. That would be dodgy. We go, no, we have a duty to include people, wherever they come from, whatever their health condition. And we often disable people by the complexity nowadays, for example, interact with my bank, I have to go online. There isn't a branch very close. I have to go through a password and then another password. All this stuff. The way that our world is very confusing for people who have, for example, dementia. Can we clarify it? Can we make it simpler? Can we give people with dementia more choices over their lives? Can we support them better in the community? We do that for people with intellectual disability, younger people. Why aren't we doing it with people with dementia to help them stay in their own homes and to help them negotiate complicated city centres or whatever it might be? Depending on, there are obviously many different types of dementia, but it might be that your issue is getting lost or forgetting faces or needing to be reminded of things. One of the great things that I've experienced in recent years is working with dementia pioneers. There are all these wonderful deep groups, dementia groups through the country. And I've had the great joy of collaborating with Wendy and Agnes Houston and other people with dementia on this project called Dementia Inquiries, funded by National Lottery Charities Fund. And what we're trying to say is, look, people with dementia can do research. They might know what's best for them. We might want to listen to them and partner with them more. And we're getting some really interesting research from communities, from these local groups of people with dementia. And I love that. And of course, we should listen to people with disability, people with intellectual disability, people with autism, and people with dementia. Because, the bottom line, sorry, one more thing. In the past, you were diagnosed with dementia late, and sadly, you probably declined quite quickly and maybe dead in a few years. Now, you might be diagnosed with dementia, signs of dementia, 5 or even 10 years before it actually interrupts your life. And so it's not, as it were, a death sentence anymore. It's something people live with. And so we've got in the community all of these older folk, not just older folk, but mainly older folk, living with dementia, perfectly functional, possibly, occasionally confused or a bit slow about things and so forth, but demanding their rights, and that is really welcome.
Yeah, I mean, she's written, Wendy Mitchell has written a book about it. And one of the other things she said, which chimes in with the idea of accommodating the society we live in for people with dementia, simple things like when you have a flat screen TV, that can seem to some people with dementia like a hole in the wall, and just covering that over, or the way that technology has changed. So she won't pick up the phone and have conversation on the phone because people can't see you thinking when you're on the phone. So FaceTime is really good, and it's things like that. I think a bit of understanding. So even when you're a family member and you're trying to get to grips with, well, how is this affecting the person that I love? If we've got better awareness and understanding of the rights of people who have living with dementia, I think that's quite powerful. One thing that was really interesting in what you were saying is the inclusive way that some of the research you're doing is with including people who have a disability, and it's a bit of a no-brainer, but I do find the whole idea of we'll call co-produce care, but co-production in research is a topic by itself, really. But it seems that you're just doing it.
Well, we're trying to, yeah. Because, as you know, in the disability movement, there's this principle, nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
And so it seems a bit daft, really, to set about, well, whether it's research with disabled children or people with dementia or disabled people in Africa or people receiving personal assistance, whatever, without asking folk and without sitting down with them and going, okay, what's the priority? What do you want done? What questions should we ask? How should we analyze it? When we've got the results, how can we promote it? How can we disseminate it? All of those things, obviously, people with disabilities can do. I'm a person with disability. I do research. So people with disabilities and many different disabilities can do research. So, it would be very odd if there was a sector of research about women or about black folk where there were no women and there were no black folk involved. We would feel, oh my goodness, this isn't quite right. So it makes perfect sense to me that in the sector of disability, we should try and support people to become researchers and partner with them and all the rest of it. Now, at the same time, research is a skill. You have to learn it. People do PhDs. It takes them at least 3 years. So you can't suggest that an afternoon course turns you into a researcher. But I hope that by helping people understand what research involves, we can turn them into a partner. And if they really want to become a researcher, that's fine. We will support them to become researchers. But we need a sort of almost like a division of labor. And like activism, for example, is not the same as research. Activism, you want to change policy, you want to recruit people, you want to get them angry and all the rest of it. Sometimes research is a bit calmer than that and is a bit more, whatever the word is, considered and reflective than that. And so it depends on the situation. Sometimes we need activism, sometimes we need research, but all the time we should work together.
Yeah, that's really interesting and important, I think. I wanted to move on to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's the UNCRPD. So the UK signed up to it in 2006, and it was a very co-produced convention because it was co-created with people who experience disability. And it's strong on independent living, autonomy, dignity, but the UK is has been criticised by the committee that goes and inspects member states like the UK on how well they're complying with the convention, and were quite non-compliant in a lot of ways. I'd just like to understand, your take on the UNCRPD. Is it something that has just been signed up to because there's a lot of other countries who are signing up to it and it's seen like a good thing to do? Or should we really be paying more attention and raising awareness of it because it focuses on people with a disability, and it's got some, really interesting demands from member states, from countries who've signed up to it?
I think that the CRPD is a great document. There are 50 articles, and as you say, it covers everything: dignity and healthcare and education, employment, all the rest of it. And it's a sort of aspiration document. And I think 150 or more, no, much more than 150 countries have ratified it. And of course, the UK is included. I mean, if you're looking at services for disabled people, the UK is one of the best places in the world, unquestionably, much better than most places. So
Okay.
that's a fact. But what a key principle in the convention is of progressive realization. And this was put in to really recognize the fact that many countries are too poor to offer the services that we would hope that a good country would offer. So the principle of progressive realization says, look, move on the right direction, move to bit by bit within the resources you have to deliver on the promises that you signed up to. And the problem with Britain is that the process of welfare reform since 2007-8 cut back and reduced entitlements. And it's that which has made the committee say there are these grievous human rights violations that, if you signed up to the convention, if you ratified the convention, you shouldn't be making it worse. And the UK has definitely made it worse. There's evidence of that. So that's why they've been targeted. But I still want to say that the services here are not bad. They need to be better, but they're not bad. One of the things that many people are worried about, as I say, is education and trying to get children with disabilities access to support in schools and to get places in schools. And some of the shifts towards academies and towards off-rolling and towards statements, they're called EHICs now. All of these things have made it harder for children with disabilities. And there seems to be more drift towards segregated special schooling than inclusive schooling. So there are lots of things there which should be matters of concern, and which rightly the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is saying, look, this isn't good enough. So it's a mixed picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
In many areas, the UK is good, but where it's eroding the rights of persons with disabilities, that is lamentable, and attention needs to be paid to it.
And just moving on to a question of the medical profession. So sometimes people might say that the way that people are treated by medical professionals sometimes lacks empathy. Maybe it's a time issue, or doctors are under a lot of stress. But I noticed you've written about whether the training for medics should change to increase their awareness of the experiences of people with disability. Maybe having people have a mentor who's a disabled person, or having some experience of visiting people who experience disability in their own home. Could you talk a bit about why you felt it was necessary to sort of talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in support of doctors and nurses and health professionals. I think they largely do a very good job. They have immense skills and knowledge. And I worked in a medical school for 5 years. What you're trying to do in that period is to cram their tiny little heads full of, pathology and pharmacology and anatomy and physiology and neurology and all of the other ologies. People pass their exams, they do a good job. But the process of that is to view disability as a medical problem, as it's to think of disabled people in terms of body parts not working, and the tests that you can send off for to check what's gone wrong, and the drugs that you can give to help people. And that gives you skilled doctors. But the trouble is, it's not about the person. It's not about the human being. It's about the collection of body parts and symptoms and signs. And we need to, at the same time as we're filling their heads full of the science, we need to say there's a person at the other side of the desk, and the other end of the stethoscope, or the from whom you've just taken blood, and the person needs to be healed. The person needs to be heard. The person needs to be respected. And one of the things that I did at Norwich Medical School was to set up this course called Working with Disabled People. And the medical students came and they met folk with disability. So they met, for example, they went and did theatre with group of people with learning difficulties. They heard from people with mental health conditions, serious mental health conditions, about their lives. They met somebody who was deafblind. They met people with dementia, and so on and so forth. And you know, meeting a person not as a patient, but as another human being, as somebody they would sit next to on the bus or in the cinema, was really empowering for them. And they got to ask the sort of the other questions and to see people as persons, as people in their own right. And I think that's what we need to expand medical training to include. And I know that Norwich is not the only medical school who does this. I know there's good initiatives at Leicester, and there was one at Oxford, and there's one at Bristol, and so forth and so on, Newcastle. That in amongst all the science, we need to remember there's a person, and a person with human rights, and just like the doctor, and they need to be treated equally. That's all we're asking. And it's not that hard, but I think the best thing you can do is to get a medical student or a nursing student or anybody else alongside a real human being who comes from a different experience. I mean, that might be a homeless person, it might be a gay person, or it might be a disabled person. But that way they get to see that they're persons, they're just human beings, just like them. They're not just collections of symptoms.
It's so interesting to hear that, because you would think when you're dealing with health, it's all about people. When you're caring for people, it's all about people. How have we got to a stage where it's so scientific that you have these reports where people have felt that they're just dealt as a number, or something that people have to see or deal with or fix? I find it quite bizarre, but it's just the nature.
It's troubling, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
it's the pressure. I mean, there's a lot of pressure in the health service, huge amount of pressure. That's one thing. Also, people are very much more specialized. My dad was a doctor, and he was a generalist, really. But now it's not even that you're a pediatrician. It's that you're a pediatrician of leukemia or autism or whatever. You're very specialized. You're not a cardiologist anymore. You have a particular specialism in a particular area of cardiology. And so the more that we specialize, rightly, you've got to have that expertise, the more we lose sight of the big picture.
Yeah. So we've come on to the part of the interview which I do, and we ask a couple of cactus questions. So these are prickly questions about social care. I don't actually have the cactus with me, but normally when I'm doing a video in the office, we have a cactus for
I'll
visual
imagine the
effect.
cactus.
You
Yeah.
imagine the cactus. There we are. They're not particularly prickly actually today, but interesting. So the one we're asking everyone, because it is the 20th of November 2019, and there's a lot going on around Brexit. So the question is, in what way do you think Brexit may or may not affect your area of study or interest, whether that's positively or negatively? What's your take on it?
I think that we don't know, but we're worried. Me and my friends are worried that, for example, many of the drugs that we rely on every day come from abroad. I mean, I'm not diabetic, so my drugs are not, don't need to be cold chain, but I still rely on drugs that are made elsewhere. Will there be enough of them in the NHS? Will they come on time? And will they be there when I need them? That's one set of questions. The second set of questions is, healthcare, social care is people. And it's people in the form of doctors and nurses and all the rest of it, many of whom come from abroad. But it's also people in terms of care workers. And whether you employ your own personal assistants or whether you rely on home care or you're in a care home, you probably will have been supported by somebody from Czech Republic, Poland, Bulgaria, not to mention, Nigeria and Brazil. And if they can't come to Britain anymore, then we're going to have a problem because it's harder to recruit workers. Everybody has problems recruiting workers. And we know that people come here because they can get a wage. And often care jobs are entry-level jobs because you often don't need particular qualifications. Therefore, are we going to have problems recruiting people? And that's a big concern.
Yeah. It's similar to a lot of people saying a similar sort of thing, actually. The second one is, does the media exacerbate violence against people who have a disability?
Um, I'm not sure. I think there is some evidence that, for example, Glasgow Media Group and Strathclyde Centre for Disability Research did a study of the newspapers. It was called Bad News for Disabled People. And it was found that the process of so-called welfare reform exacerbated the idea of disabled people as scroungers and disabled people as being unfairly supported by the welfare state. And this did lead to hostility in the street. It led to the idea of disabled people as not deserving what they got, as disabled people perhaps as targets for financial exploitation. And we know that there was hate crime and abuse as a result. So I think that's partly a government policy issue, partly red top tabloid media representation. I heard a year or two ago a guy who used a wheelchair and was wheeling back to his Motability car and was, about to transfer to get inside it. And a mum with a baby in a pram went past and said, "I pay for that car."
Oh,
And she was
goodness.
referring to, at that stage, disability living allowance, and basically saying it's unfair that you've got this car and I haven't. And he was nonplussed. He was stunned. But then a bit later, he realized what he should have said. He should have pointed to the baby and said, "I paid for that baby." Because those parents get child benefit. Because we live in a welfare state where we support people with extra need. Whether you're a child, having a child, whether you're a pensioner, whether you're a disabled person, it doesn't matter. We agree that we should support people with extra need. And there's a rigorous assessment process. The levels of fraud are tiny, 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 much less, I think, than 1%. So to think of disabled people who get benefits as scroungers would be as wrong and unfair as thinking as mums with babies and toddlers as claiming child benefit when they shouldn't get it. We live in a supportive society and we cannot lose sight of that. And sadly, sometimes tabloids encourage us to stigmatize people, to blame victims, and to be hostile to people. And people who read tabloids don't always, A, the story is probably wrong in the first place, but B, even if it is factually accurate, it's not everybody, it's not everybody who is like that. So even when there has been some rare cases of abuse, we can't then think all disabled people are scroungers any more than we can think of, all women get pregnant to get child benefits. Just nonsense, and dangerous nonsense at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost the argument that the media should be more accountable for what it puts out there and the effects that it has on people. But yeah, that's interesting to hear your views on that. So the other question is, you've written or you've talked, I think, on Radio 4 before about select committees. And one of the select committees, which is relevant to us, of course, is the Health and Social Care Committee. So just wondering whether you felt that that committee in particular was a help or a hindrance to the rights of people with disabilities.
I think that parliamentary committees in the House of Lords and the House of Commons are good. I think select committees in particular, which hold government to account, are essential. So I am fully in favour of them. The piece that I can't comment on the Health and Social Care Committee because I don't know its work in detail, but I would be very surprised if it hasn't done sensible stuff. I hope it's done sensible stuff. What I was commenting on in that piece was the sort of tendency of certain people in the House of Commons to become sort of almost prima donnas, and it's all about them. And I think one of the people I criticised was Keith Vaz. Well, I'm not going to say anything more about that gentleman, but people know what has happened to Keith Vaz. But, whether it's the Speaker, who did great work, but was a bit self-centered, pompous, whether it was the chair of a select committee, whether it's me, I'm sure people think I'm pompous and up myself. Whoever we are, however significant or powerful or well published or media, exposed we are, we all pee in the same way. We all, are flawed human beings, and I think it's up to us to realise, to be humble. I think humility is a very good thing among public servants. And it was only that I was getting a
Yeah.
bit aerated about, because a lot of the chairs of select committees were on our newspapers and on our screens every day. And you thought, yeah, this is valid, but
Mm.
don't be quite as pompous as you seem to be.
That's fine. And the ones that I've watched, I've been very impressed by the Health and Social Care Committee myself, and they are doing. They do have some clout actually, and it's
Good.
interesting, and it's good to see people, whether it's from CQC, Care Quality Commission, or the NHS or NHS England, just having to have, and they're televised a lot of the the debates that they have, and the questions that they ask, and they also involve people with lived experience. So you'll
And
have
it
people.
makes them accountable. It
It
makes them
does, yeah,
accountable and visible, and that can only be good. And that's what a select committee does, isn't it? It's
yeah,
it's they are our representatives asking the questions in many cases that we've suggested,
yeah,
and holding them to account, because MPs have power. So more power to their elbow. I'm very, very much in favour.
yeah. Great. Okay, so that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much, Tom. Um,
It's my pleasure, Sophie, and again, let's talk more.
Yeah, it's just been great. I can't wait to listen back actually. Um, but for anybody who is new to Professor Tom Shakespeare or wants to find out more about what you're talking about, a wealth of information, um, I've got down farmerofthoughts.co.uk as your website.
That's
Um,
right. And so
yeah.
I try to put everything I've written up there, and you can roam around. Big prize for finding the article about dogs.
Okay, I didn't find that one actually. And there's YouTube videos as well. Even if you just, I think, search your name on YouTube, you've done a few lectures which are helpful. Twitter, is it at Tommy Shakes? That's the one.
That's correct. Yeah,
Brilliant.
and everybody's welcome. And it's the conversation that's important. It's not Tom Shakespeare, the professor. It's all of us working with each other to try and understand things,
Hmm,
and where and to publicize things. Because I'm a Democrat. I believe we all have something to say.
brilliant. That's a great note to end on, I think. Okay, so I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Tom. That's fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Sophie.